I actually recall one of the more bizarre experiences I've had as a pastor involving a woman at a prior church who we'll call Christy. And this happened years ago, so hopefully this is all way diffused by now. But Christy and her husband were very involved in the church, and we considered them close personal friends. You know, we hung out, our children played together and that sort of stuff. And one day, Christy becomes seriously ill, where she starts having these severe seizures, and she would fall to the ground, become stiff as a board, and just tremble in unimaginable pain. And of course, everyone in our church is very concerned about this, and so the people in our church would go and visit Christy. We had a big prayer vigil at the church. We brought her and her family meals for weeks, if not months at a time. And people wanted to tangibly be able to do something for this poor young mother who is struck down in the prime of her life with this excruciating illness. And our church responded beautifully. And I was so proud of how caring and supportive the church was to Christy and her family during this time. However, as time went by, and this occurred over at least a period of several months, I began to have some doubts. Some things didn't add up. There were some things that were kind of fishy about the whole situation. For starters, Christy's episodes, which is what she called it when she had a seizure, always seemed to happen at very convenient times. Like when she wanted more attention or when she needed something from someone. She could never give anyone a diagnosis of exactly what was wrong with her, and she finally settled on fibromyalgia, but fibromyalgia did not have the symptoms that she was experiencing. And then one day, a very respected member of our church who was an ER nurse came to me and said, "I don't know what you do with this information. I just thought you should know that Christy has been blackballed from every ER in the region for abusing the system with false alarms." And Christy also seemed to kind of enjoy the attention and kind of relish in it. And she was very bold about asking the church and even individuals to help her and do very specific things for her. She actually convinced one wealthy family in the church to give her a considerable amount of money to help her and her husband through this time. And so I began to kind of watch Christy, especially when she thought no one was looking. Because when she thought no one was looking, she would appear normal. She would physically relax, and you couldn't tell that anything was wrong with her. But as soon as she saw or thought that someone was looking at her, she would become symptomatic again. She would stiffen up, and her limbs would become rigid, almost like she was paraplegic or something like that. And I really didn't quite know what to do with this information or with this particular situation, because I wasn't 100% sure, and just about everyone in the congregation felt like, that she was telling the truth, or that, this was a real situation. And if I pressed it, I could really come off as a very callous individual, or if I was wrong, or I just didn't know what to do. And let me kind of share with you a little bit of the dynamic of how this works using one particular illustration. One day, Christy and her husband come to worship, and they sit in the back row, which was very, very unusual because they never sat in the back row. They always sat on the second row, right on the center aisle. And my wife, Cindy, says, look out. better look out. Christy's going to come forward and she's going to turn this whole thing into a circus. And I said, oh, no, she wouldn't do a thing like that. And sure enough, during the prayer time, here comes Christy, hobbling down the aisle as if she is on the cusp of death. Inch by every hard-fought inch, trembling, exhausted, but determined. All eyes are on her. She swoons no less than 3 times, and her doting husband catches her and lifts her back to her feet, but she pushes him away because she's too proud for him to carry her. She's going to make it on her own. And so as she very slowly makes her way to the front, people are openly weeping. And they're waiting with bated breath, clasping their hands and praying that she makes it to the front. After the service, several of the leaders of our congregation came to me and just gushed about how brave and courageous she was and what an incredible faith she has. And Pastor, can you use any influence that you have to put her in contact with the Women of Faith conferences? Because Christy needs to be leading seminars. She needs to be leading conferences and inspiring people with her story and her faith. It took all my considerable influence as pastor to diffuse the situation and kind of help Christy understand that she doesn't need to be sick any longer. Several years later, a mutual friend runs into Christy's husband. And they've since divorced. And the friend was one of the deacons in the church. I had since moved on at that time, but he was one of the deacons in the church, and he was one of those ones, one of the few that felt things didn't quite add up. He was in her small group, and he kind of was privileged to some things. And so he asked her husband, he said, look, I want to ask you a sensitive question, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But remember a few years back when Christy was sick? Was that for real? Was she really sick? And her husband got this huge grin on his face. And he started shaking his head. And he goes, no, she wasn't sick. He said, you mean that all of that was phony, that all of it was fake? And he started nodding his head. He goes, every single minute. And so my friend, he immediately gets out his phone and he calls me and he goes, you'll never guess what I heard. And he told me and I was like, I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. And the truth is that while Christy was never physically sick, she was certainly spiritually sick. And as far as I can tell from knowing her, and I knew her well, she was somewhat insecure. And she wanted people to like her. She wanted people to pay attention to her. She wanted to be respected. She wanted people to admire her and to think well of her spiritually. You know, to think that she's a spiritual person because she had never quite been that person. And it's so easy for us to come down on Christy for being conniving and manipulative and deceptive and self-serving and on all of those things. And it's true. But sometimes, in some ways, are not just about all of us, guilty of some of those same things. I mean, not in that way. I mean, we wouldn't do what it is that she did. But, other subtle things. I'll give you, for instance, Christian pollsters have a really hard time polling the Christian community because they lie. I mean, they just do. People lie about their spirituality. For example, when you ask Americans at large, how many of you go to church, roughly in the neighborhood of 60% of people will claim to go to church. Even if you ask them, did you go to church Sunday? They will say they went to church Sunday. However, there are not enough seats in all the churches and worship centers all across America to accommodate, 1/3 of that number. And so pollsters have learned when dealing with Christians, you have to ask them the questions in a backdoor way where Christians don't know what it is that you are asking them. And so you say, the question is, what did you do this weekend? Or list the activities you did this weekend and maybe put a whole bunch of things over there. And when you do that, about 12 to 13% will say they actually went to church this past Sunday because they don't know that's what you're looking for. And we also know that happens to be the correct number because it's been validated about 3 or 4 different other ways. About 12 to 13% of Americans are in church on any particular Sunday. A full 1/5 or 20% of the people who will claim to have been in church if you just ask them straight up. The same is true with giving. If people gave what they said they give, then every church in America would have at least twice as much, if not 3 or 4 times as much money to do God's kingdom work. The same is true with Bible reading, prayer, witnessing, those kinds of things. Why can't we just be honest about our spirituality? Why can't we tell the truth? Because we want people to like us. We want people to think well of us. We want them to believe that we're spiritual, certainly much more spiritual than we really are, including an anonymous religious pollster. You guys know the drill. You get up on Sunday morning, and maybe you're having a bad morning. And so one of the family members is cranky, and so everybody else gets cranky, and you're going to church in the car, and maybe it's just dead silent because everybody's mad, or maybe there's an argument, or who knows. But the minute you pull into the parking lot, everybody just puts on that mask, and it's all serenity and joy and peace, and aren't we wonderful people? Or you run into that person and they're telling you some things about their life and they're really struggling, and you feel like the proper response is, hey, I'm going to be praying for you. But you haven't prayed in weeks and you know that you probably won't be praying again anytime soon. Or you're in a Bible class or in a small group or something like that and you give that answer in just the right way that causes you to come off really well. In my quiet time the other day, I was reading in Matthew 18, and, when I was on that mission trip last year, that kind of stuff. And so we put on this mask because we want to come off a certain way. And the interesting thing is that Jesus speaks to this. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, which is, again, the cornerstone of Jesus' teaching, Jesus' ethic, what we're about, how we're to live, what it is to dwell in the kingdom of God and how to embrace the kingdom of God, Jesus spends a lot of time talking about spiritual authenticity. And for some reason, hopefully we'll figure that out today. But for some reason, this is really important to Jesus. And he spends as much time talking about spiritual authenticity as he does about anything else. And so he's like, man, I want you guys to get this. That this is important. About having a purity of how we approach God. And about how we pass ourselves off, or even why we serve God and why we do the things that we do. Motive is really important, and it's critical that we are spiritually authentic or spiritually genuine people. And so here's how Jesus says it. He says, and I'm in Matthew chapter 6, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving it may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Oh, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Then he talks about, how to pray and gives us the Lord's Prayer, which we'll talk about in subsequent weeks. And then we jump down to verse 16. And when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. In other words, spiritual authenticity does not seek to impress others. That we serve God not to impress others. And this is what Jesus is describing here in this passage. That people are going through all of these religious and sacrificial acts, to impress people, to impress upon people that they're more spiritual than they really are. And he talks about how the wealthy, give out of their abundance, which to them really isn't anything, but to the common man would seem like a small fortune. And they would go up to the synagogue, and there was a big alms box in front of the synagogue, and they would have this big parade, this big procession with all of these people, and they would blow trumpets. And the reason initially that they would blow the trumpets is so that the poor would know that a large donation has been put in the alms box, so there's now money to feed them, so they should come running because now there's going to be food. But Jesus says that you like it when they blow the trumpets because then everybody can see what good thing it is that you're doing. And he says, and some of you pray, and you pray in the synagogues, and you go on and on and on, and you pray certain phrases over and over and over again because you think that those things make you sound spiritual and that they're impressive to other people. And then on the 3 times a day when good Jews would pray, you would ensure that you're in a very conspicuous or public place. So you're on the busiest street corner in town. Oh, I just happened to be here at noon. Everybody stop, because I'm going to pray. And then they pray and make this big scene out in this very busy public place so everyone can see how spiritual they are. Or they're in the market when all the frenetic activity is going on and everybody's got to stop. And of course, they're all Jewish there, so everybody's standing around like, oh, we got to wait for this guy to finish his prayer. And he says, some of you fast, and when you do, you go out in public and you sit in the most conspicuous place that you can find, and you disfigure your face to look as pitiful and as pathetic as you possibly can. And some of you tear your clothes to enhance the effect of how destitute and pathetic you are. And some of you even take ashes, and you put the ashes on top of your head. And what do you suppose happens with ashes on top of your head in the hot Middle Eastern sun as the day goes on? You kind of sweat, and then they kind of work together, and they work down your body, and they cover you, and then you really look pathetic. And Jesus says, there's no reason for you to do that. There's no reason when you fast to go out in public and disfigure your face and tear your clothes and put ashes on your head, because it doesn't do anything to enhance the fast. It doesn't do anything to actually help the fast and the purpose behind why you're doing it. The only reason that you do that is to draw attention to yourself. And when you give, there's no reason for you to go and parade yourself with all the pomp and ceremony that you do to go give money to that alms box. And what Jesus knew and all his hearers knew is there was also another alms box in the back of all of the synagogues for people who wish to give anonymously. And he's saying the only reason that you give in the way that you do is to draw attention to yourself. And when you pray, there's no reason for you at 9 and 12 and 3 o'clock to ensure that you're in a public place. In fact, why don't you ensure at those times that you are in a private place? Someplace quiet where there's solitude so that you can actually commune with God, which after all is the purpose of prayer. The only reason for you to do it the way that you do it is to draw attention to yourself. So in essence, he's saying you guys are just playing spiritual games. And you may actually impress others, but you do not impress God. That God does not respond to your empty and superficial religious activity. And it's the same thing with us. And I think in a sense we all do it, and it's all human nature. Because the point is, or I guess what I'm trying to say is that, we're all human. Every single one of us are flawed. We're broken. Every one of us, there's a sense of darkness somewhere inside that we're trying to work out, we're trying to get better, but it's there. And we have issues and we have problems, but we don't want anybody to know these things. It's like Adam and Eve in the garden. Remember, they're walking around, naked and unashamed and everything's good because there's no sin. And then they sin, and what's the first thing they do? They want to hide. They want to cover. And likewise, we very naturally, we want to hide who we are. We want to cover it up. We don't want people to think those things about us. We want them to think well of us. Because again, it's human nature. We want people to like us. We want them to admire us. We want them to respect us. We want them to think that we are more spiritual than we really are. And so we play those little games that I just talked about. Well, I'll pray for you. When I was having my quiet time the other day, or, you put on that mask at church, and that's probably the worst. We do it at church. And so everybody at church is walking around, and man, we're all so spiritual and we're all so wonderful because we want people to think we're wonderful, and we want them to think we're spiritual and that we have the perfect marriage and perfect kids, and we're just wonderful, spiritual, sacrificial people. And at some level, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of being here. We come here as sinners saved by grace to help each other work through spirituality and to encourage one another and edify one another and pray for one another and be real with one another, so that this can be the place where transformation takes place. This can be a place where we challenge one another and work with one another and help with one another and walk with one another through the problems of life, so that we can move towards Christ's likeness or towards the person of Christ. But if we're all walking around wearing masks, it defeats the whole purpose of all of it. And it's just some kind of weird dance that we all kind of go through on Sunday. I was reading a book this week about a guy who works in AA, and he was talking to one of the AA members who used to go to the church that they meet in, but now just goes to the AA meetings. And the guy asked him, he said, why don't you go to church anymore? And he says, because it's just so much more real down here. I get so much more help up here. I don't fit up there with all those perfect people. And the truth is, the AA meeting, and the way he went on to describe, was functioning way more like the church than the church was functioning that they were meeting in. And so, we don't serve God to impress others. That's not why we do this. And Jesus is warning us against this. I believe also, as we look at this passage, we see, I think there's another side to this as well. And that is that, that yes, we don't serve God to impress others, but we also don't serve God to impress ourselves. Look at what's transpiring here, what Jesus is describing. These people are going out of their way to appear much more spiritual than they really are. They want people to believe that they are very spiritual. They want people to believe that they are superior. They want to be better than other people. I give more than you. I pray more than you. I sacrifice more than you. Hence, I am better than you. And let's just get raw honest here for a moment. Sometimes we even impress ourselves with how awesome we are, don't we? And we would never say it like that, ever. Because that's arrogant and we're way too humble to put it that way, but it's really kind of the truth. So let me see if I can't turn that around and ask it a different way. Do other Christians frustrate you? Do other Christians often have a hard time living up to your standards? They're not as committed as you are. They're not as loving as you. They're not as passionate or radical as you are. They're not as theologically endowed or as enlightened as you are. They don't pray as much as you. They don't give as much as you. They don't serve as much as you. They don't go on as many mission trips as you go on. They don't worship in the same way you do. All those other Christians, they just don't get it. And they frustrate you. They try your patience. They're disappointing. To bear the cross of all the nominalism that's around me. A guy by the name of Larry Osborne addresses this phenomenon in his book, Accidental Pharisees. And his contention is that while religious zeal and spiritual fervor can be a wonderful and beautiful thing, and should be a wonderful and beautiful thing, it's a good thing. But we have to be careful to fall into the most heinous of temptations, which is spiritual pride, judgmentalism, and exclusivity. And he then goes on to describe kind of the process and the nuances of how that works. And I'm going to read that, a little bit of that in a moment. But I'll tell you this, he is exactly right. He's 100% dead on. In the 30 or so years that I've been in vocational ministry, I've seen this, hundreds of times. And to be honest with you, I've been guilty of it myself a time or two. And so I want to share with you a little bit of what Larry says. And I normally don't read like this, but man, he says it so well and so beautifully. And again, he's so right on with this. Listen to what he says. He says, the journey to becoming an accidental Pharisee usually starts out innocently enough. It's often triggered by an eye-opening event. Sometimes it's a mission trip, a conference, or a powerful new book. Sometimes it's a small group experience that makes everything else, feel like you've just been playing church. Or perhaps a new Bible teacher who opens your eyes to things you've never seen before. So you step out in faith. You make some big changes. You clean up areas of sin and compromise. You add new spiritual disciplines as you excitedly race off towards the front line of following Jesus. But as you press forward, it's inevitable that you begin to notice that some people lag behind. And it's at this point that your personal pursuit of holiness can morph into something dangerous. A deepening sense of frustration with those who don't share your passionate pursuit of holiness. This is the critical juncture. If you allow your frustration to turn to disgust and disdain for people you've left behind, then you'll end up on a dangerous detour. Instead of becoming more like Jesus, you'll become more like his arch enemies, the Pharisees of old, looking down on others, confident in your own righteousness. I'll tell you what, that's like a sucker punch to the gut. Because I've done that. You know, I've been guilty of that too. And he continues, and I'll read just a little bit more. He says, spiritual comparisons are particularly silly. We don't always know the full story. All we see is the outside. There's no way to see the heart. This means that a lot of our conclusions about people are flat out wrong. Our spiritual comparisons are also incredibly biased. We have an amazing ability to compare things in a way that causes us to come out on top. And when we come out on top, it's hard not to look down on people who don't measure up. It's at this point that pride becomes particularly dangerous. Unfortunately, many of us fail to grasp how dangerous pride is. We know we shouldn't look down on others, but we tend to see it as a small sin. It's not the kind of thing you go to prison for. It falls somewhere between failing to floss and driving too fast. It's something to work on, but no big deal. Even if we admit to periodic bouts with pride, what most of us mean is, it's tough staying humble when I'm so much better than everyone else. The issue of spiritual pride, I believe, is a particular temptation in today's day and age. And I'll give you, for instance, that has to maybe do with our technology a little bit. Because we live in this day and age now of personal branding. And a lot of you, those of you under 30, most of you under 40, know what I'm talking about. Maybe a couple of you under 50. I'm 50, so I'm right on the cusp. I really don't know what I'm talking about, but I talk to people who are 30, and they tell me this is true. But personal branding is anything. And what I mean by that is through social media, you can be anything you want to be. And so people spend incredible amounts of time and energy crafting just the right image of themselves using various handles, likes, dislikes, sexuality, relationship, gender, causes, affiliations, links, blogs, all of these sorts of things. And people are very conscious of their personal brand and go out of their way to ensure that everybody views them and everybody sees them in the way that they want to be seen. And so Christians will use social media to ensure that they project the correct or the right type of spirituality. That they would like to appear in the same way that they want to appear social and with it and all of these other, when you're on social media, you give these appearances. But if spirituality is a part of your life, then you want people to believe that you're spiritual as well. And we do this, again, with, various affiliations or causes or whatnot. Sometimes we'll put on a certain worship band or a certain worship song that communicates just the right thing about spirituality. Or we'll go on and on about a certain theology, and we'll quote certain books and link to certain like-minded bloggers because that theology is really impressive. Or we'll put endless pics of us in Haiti or Yugoslavia, working with orphans or something like that, and complete with impassioned pleas to be compassionate and to be involved, with these same people. And sometimes, and not all the time, I'm not saying that we only do this for improper motives, but sometimes we do these things, and when we do these things, we do them because we like what it says about us. We like what it implies about our spirituality because it makes us better. And it makes us better than we are. And so when we post, and in those times when our posting or when our online profile or whatever is motivated by self-promotion, we have fallen in, have we not, to the exact same trap that Jesus is talking about here with the folks who are praying a certain way and giving a certain way and fasting a certain way. Because we're presenting ourselves with a motive to promote ourselves and how spiritual we are. And again, I'm not saying that we do that all the time, but you know as well as I do that in the online community, not everybody's honest and everybody's trying to put that image out there. And when that goes in and bleeds into our spirituality and we do it there, we're doing the exact same thing. And the truth is that we don't serve God to impress others. We don't serve God to impress ourselves. And I think half the time we're trying to convince ourselves that we're spiritual as much as we're trying to impress somebody else. But there's a third area I think is important for us to talk about, and I'll do this in closing, and that is, we don't serve God to impress others. We don't serve God to impress ourselves. We also don't serve God to impress God. And I think some of us do that. We do some activity and we think, oh man, God must be really amazed at how awesome I am. And God must think I'm way super cool, and He must think that I am so spiritual. I must so impress God, and He's going to have to bless me for all these wonderful things that I am and that I do. And we've already talked about how God sees through all of that, and He knows exactly who we are. He knows who we are when nobody's looking, and He knows what we think and all of those things. So I'm not even going to go into all the things about, why that's a futile endeavor, trying to impress God with who we are. But instead, I want to close and I want to turn it around with, why we do this, because it does have to do with our relationship with God. And we do spiritual things. We serve God, not to impress God. And maybe there's a fine line here, and I believe it's a pretty big distinction. But we serve God not to impress God, but we serve God to please God. We serve God to seek God. We do things because we want to express love and gratitude to God. We do things because we want to know Him more. And we want more of Him and who He is. And we do them because we're concerned about His kingdom. And we want to be a part of His kingdom, and we want to grow His kingdom, and we want others to experience these things as well. And in that pursuit of seeking to please God and to honor God and to love God and to know God and to genuinely serve Him, purity of heart and purity of motive are critical. Because what? Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart. Again, the Sermon on the Mount is a commentary on the Beatitudes. And so we'll just keep going back, to the Beatitudes. And here Jesus is driving home how critical purity of heart and motive and sincerity, spiritual sincerity and authenticity is As we seek him and as we try to know him. Because what he's saying is that if you miss that and it becomes a religious exercise to you, it becomes this weird, bizarre religious thing where you're trying to impress all your friends or trying to puff yourself up, then you're going to take all of that time and all that energy and all that money and everything that you've put into that, and it's going to be a complete waste of time. And you're going to get off on this weird tangent, and it's not going to do you or anybody else any good. And so he's giving us this really insightful challenge that when you seek God, be sure that you do it with a pure heart. Be sure that you're really seeking God and not something else. Be sure that you do it in a humble way. Again, being poor in spirit. Because the opposite, what he's describing here, is pride. You know, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. You know, when you pray, go into your closet. When you fast, put on nice clothes and put oil on your head. Why? Because that doesn't puff you up. That doesn't feed your pride. It does just the opposite. It leads to humility. But it leads to authenticity. I think one of the things that the church needs more of today is authenticity. Christians who are living out an ethic and living out a spirituality, what Jesus is describing here, because I think one of the things that the world reacts so strongly against are fake, phony Christians who are playing at being all self-righteous and well, I'm better than you. And people who are doing exactly what Jesus described in this passage. And again, we all face that temptation because we all, we struggle. But I think that if we can get this and what it means to walk through life and through our relationship with God with a sense of humility and a sense of purity of heart and a sense of honesty, that it takes our spirituality in a direction that's not negative, that's not destructive, which is what he's describing with these people who are doing these things, but he takes it into a direction that's so healthy and so positive. And that genuinely enables us to connect with God and to grow in God and to grow closer to him and more intimate with him in ways that we never experienced before. And so in many ways, the Christian life is an exercise in honesty. It's an exercise in humility. As we learn more and more of who we are before God, that we might grow deeper and deeper in love with him as we seek to follow him. And as we do that, it changes our lives, but it also changes the lives of those around us. And I believe that's why Jesus spent so much time talking about this very thing in the Sermon on the Mount. He devotes a lot of time to it because it's important. And so today, it's kind of an inner life kind of thing. So it's not some challenge where, you need to go out and do this or not do this. But it's an attitudinal thing. It's a perspective. It's about, our walk with God. And to challenge us to be people who are authentic, humble, and honest as we seek purity of motive in everything we do in our relationship with God. As we seek to be authentic and present ourselves in real, honest ways before the world, before ourselves, and before our God.